3, 2, 1.
Good morning and welcome to this segment of Becoming His Beloved, answering God's call to discipleship through a systematic study of the Bible from beginning to end, looking for the ways the Bible discloses and teaches us the principles of personal discipleship. We are now to the fifth book of Moses, Deuteronomy. We have been through 40 years since the liberation of the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, by God, taking them to the land that was promised to Abraham for his descendants. His chosen descendants are the Israelites. Deuteronomy is unique in the books of the Bible in that it covers a very short period of time. Everything that occurs in Deuteronomy happens over a 2-month period. They are 60 days after 40 years. They are 60 days approximately from entering the promised land. Mallory, if we could go to the map. If you will notice, they left Egypt, went down to Sinai at the bottom of the map that you're looking at. And then they journeyed back up to right below Canaan in the area that's circled in red, stayed there for 38 years. We discussed all of that last segment. Now, the time has come. The Israelites are about to enter and take the promised land. Another thing about this 60 days that we have that is covered by Deuteronomy, only 30 of that will Moses be alive, 30 days. Moses is approximately 30 days away from being claimed by God to be taken, as the Bible says, to your fathers. Moses is not going to enter the promised land. He is now 120 years old. He started leading the Israelites at God's command and insistence, as you remember, 40 years before this. Unwilling, didn't want to do it, choose somebody else. No, I can't talk. You need somebody else. But he did it. He was 80 years old when he was spoken to by the burning bush. Now he's 120. The last 30 days of his life, covering Deuteronomy, they are up at the very top of the map, above the Dead Sea, which is kind of highlighted in purple. The Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, and they are going to cross the Jordan River about midway of the land of Canaan, the promised land. In other words, they're going to come in to the side with a good portion of the country to the south and a good portion to the north. Moses uses these last 30 days because God has already told him that he's not going with them, but he is anticipating all of the things that they need to be reminded of. So the word Deuteronomy strictly translates as the second giving of laws. A lot of laws and a lot of commandments have been handed down during this 40-day period covered in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Deuteronomy being Moses' final month-long speech to the Israelites and its leaders is in many ways a repeat. Remember, we talked about how God is teaching his people, and one of the great tools or characteristics of successful teaching is teaching by repetition of important points so that they can be remembered and the importance of those points amplified. So a lot of Deuteronomy is a reminder of a lot of the things that they already are supposed to know, but there's a lot of new things too. Most of Deuteronomy is Moses' final heartfelt speech to his several million people. Now, the Israelites who are listening to Moses now, about to go into the promised land, I think it would not be overdramatic to characterize them as an entirely different population than the population that 40 years before had left Egypt. We've touched on this all through the segments. That population that left Egypt were not spiritual. They were not raised as children with any idea of God. In fact, the religion that would become the Judeo-Christian faith didn't have any structure. And remember, one of the first things when Moses was representing God to the Pharaoh, and God told Moses to go to the people and tell them this and that, remember that important question that Moses asked God. Who am I to tell them that you are? We've come a long ways from that moment. The people that are listening to Moses about to enter the promised land in the book of Deuteronomy, they have God living with them, symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle where they worship. Most of them were not even born or were small children at Mount Sinai. They are now middle-aged. They have been raised in the presence of God. They are a much more spiritual, much more obedient, much more prepared to go into the promised land. In the area of repetition, though, and because of this, Moses in the book of Deuteronomy repeats 35 times during his speeches to the Israelites that God has promised Abraham for you to have this land. Very important that it is God that is giving this land to you. He then repeats 34 times, but you've got to take it. God's strength is going to be what takes it, but you've got to do it. And you have got to be very obedient. And then he reiterates all through Deuteronomy as a central theme that when you obey God, your obedience and trust produces blessings. When you do not obey God and trust Him, your disobedience equals spiritual and life failure. Isn't that interesting that the central part of Deuteronomy is in essence a repetition itself of the exact covenant that 500 years before God had with Abraham? Nothing has changed in that regard. So Moses is the prophet of God, the first one in the Bible and in this religion who has an intense relationship with God and a very big job to do being led by God. As a prophet, Moses fills Deuteronomy with predictions that he only could know from his hearing the voice of God. It is in Deuteronomy that we have the first prediction that there would be a great one, the Messiah. The Messiah is mentioned for the first time in the Bible as a coming thing in the progress of the revelations of God and the progress of His people, that there would be a Messiah and the attributes of a Messiah. Moses is the first to mention that. He also mentions that it is highly likely, in fact, almost a sure thing, that even though God has been leading the people of Israel, that when they get to the promised land, that they will come to a point where they will choose, demand, and decide, even though God does not favor it, to be governed by a king. There hasn't been any king so far. There hasn't been any talk of a king. And there won't be for several hundred more years. But Moses the prophet predicts very specifically that you will go against God and you will choose a king, and you will have some good kings, but most of them are going to take and take and take until everything is ruined, and then you will become so dejected that you will fall away from obedience to God, and God will abandon the kingdom, and it will be divided, and it will be dissipated. All of this predicted by Moses before any of it even begins. So he was a prophet. His main concern, however, in delivering this soliloquy at the end of his life was his concern that as they go into the promised land and scatter into the portions that are being set up for each of the tribes to govern and to occupy, that they will lapse into idolatry. Remember the first commandment, "You shall have no other God before me." God is always serious about that. Moses is concerned that as they scatter and as they're left to themselves, that they will adopt the gods of the land they're going into. He doesn't say so, but remember, just like we've had problems for the last 40 years with people kind of adopting the gods of the Egyptians that they had left, the golden calf. He predicts all manner of things that will happen and the effects. And as we go through the Bible, you will notice, as I have, every one of the things that Moses predicts in the book of Deuteronomy happens exactly the way Moses predicted or feared that it would. But central to all of Deuteronomy, central to it is something that is very inspiring, very interesting, and very understandable, but brand new. You noticed when we put up at the beginning of this, Deuteronomy, love God, obey God. It's the central message of Deuteronomy, but there's something new about this. In Deuteronomy, Moses, for the first time, introduces the commandment of God that we are to love Him. Through Genesis and all of the other 4 books of Moses, there has been all kinds of mentions of our relationship with God as the Israelites were experiencing. But love was not one of them. We take that for granted, don't we, since we are raised from the first moments of realization of spiritual life and what it means to be a Christian. We have imbued, we are saturated with the idea, at Sunday school, sermons, everywhere, that we are to love God. Up until this point, that was a foreign idea. So what's changed? What's happened? God has been living now for 40 years with His people. He has been teaching His people. He has been giving His people, out of their trust and obedience, He has been giving them triumph and success after triumph and success. When they were flawed and disobeyed Him, He used each of those instances, sometimes harshly, as teaching moments to discipline them. Now we have reached the point where, out of our trust from God and seeing His goodness, that we are to love Him. Well, that love is an interesting concept from the standpoint of our seeking to answer God's call to discipleship. You see, it's not the kind of love like we think of, well, I love my wife, I love my children. It's not that kind of love. That's a natural emotion-driven love that is an attribute, and a good one, of human beings. The spiritual version of the love of God is a willful love. The love that God is talking about, and it's mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5 through 7. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. In other words, as my disciples, as my people, as my chosen ones, what you are to do is to commit out of your trust in me, your perception of my goodness, you are to commit and will to love me. That is an extremely important portion of discipleship. The commitment to loving and obeying God. Jesus recognized it. He quoted what I just read you directly from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, powerful lessons in discipleship. Thank you.